Hello and welcome to this video on the anatomy of the respiratory tract. The respiratory tract is everything from your nose down to the capillary beds of your lungs. As you can imagine, this relatively straight tube to your lungs is simple in some ways, but as you descend into the bronchus and bronchi, things get more complicated. Finally, the interaction of the alveoli and capillaries that are there for gas exchange is very complex, at least in relative terms. To keep things simple, we'll follow the flow of air. While not quite Gandalf levels of wisdom, it is easier.
He's remembered.
No, but the air doesn't smell so foul down here.
Strictly speaking, your mouth is not considered part of the respiratory tract. Instead, air should be flowing through your nasal cavity. This is for a few reasons. The first is your mouth lacks many of the features of the nasal cavity. Second, it is basically a great big hole into your body, and that means anything can get in. Finally, there are the senses you lose. Your nasal cavity begins at the nostrils. These are full of fine hairs, and they exist to trap foreign substances. Anything from pollens to bacteria and viruses. After these hairs, you get to the cavity proper. This is where you find more hairs, but also turbinae and conchae. These are projections into the nasal cavity that act as a sort of baffle. They prevent air from flowing straight through the nasal cavity and further into your respiratory tract. The other effect of the turbinae and conchae is that they are covered in mucus. The mucus does two things. The first is heat and the second is humidify. If you are in a hot, dry environment, they add moisture and draw away heat. The mucus helps considerably in that. Either excess moisture helps to be reincorporated as a fluid or fundamentally condensed. If you're in a hot environment, it draws much of that heat out by the mucus because it's largely made of water, acting as a relatively effective heat condenser. It is also why in hot, humid environments like rainforests, you may find it uncomfortable when breathing. Admittedly, much more comfortable than not breathing at all, but still unpleasant. The opposite is true too. That is, they can draw out warmth and moisture. This helps to prevent humidity in your lungs, which would make breathing harder. Fundamentally, the nasal cavity maintains a quasi-state of homeostasis that ensures all air entering and leaving your body does so while ensuring the body has the right amount of moisture and warmth present. The other role the nasal cavity has is perhaps better noticeable when you are either sick with something like influenza or you are having seasonal allergies. That is, it allows for the trapping of foreign particles, and that trapping of foreign particles is largely done through mucus. When you have a running nose because you have the seasonal cold or influenza, this is what is being produced, more mucus. If you instead find that your nose becomes quite stuffed, as is often how it's described, it's because the glands that secrete that mucus that run either side of your nose are being overstimulated and then partly blocked. After the nasal cavity, you arrive at the pharynx. This is where the mouth and nose join together. The pharynx is basically a tube, and it connects the nasal cavity and the back of your mouth to the next part of your respiratory tract, which is the larynx. This is also where your body mostly ensures that food goes into your esophagus and air into the larynx. This is done by the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a flap of semi-solid material that bends under the weight of food and constriction of muscles. It does not bend when no pressure is applied. So long as it does not bend, the larynx remains open and you can freely inhale or exhale. The last part of the upper respiratory tract is the larynx. This is largely defined by two things, the vocal cords and relative lack of circular hyaline cartilage, but there are bones when compared to the trachea. While the vocal cords serve no purpose when inhaling, they do have a rather obvious and pronounced effect when exhaling. Largely the control of airflow to be the first step in speech. The larynx itself is pretty much defined by the presence of the voice box. In males, where it is more pronounced, it's the Adam's apple. In females, where it's less pronounced, you may not notice it as much until you look inside of the larynx itself. The larynx is a triangle-shaped structure. It's largely composed of cartilage that is attached to each other. Then there are muscles, and there is elastic tissue along with a few bones. The bones themselves are less important in the long run for what we're going to talk about, but you can see their location and names here. The larynx starts at the triangle-shaped inlet at the top, which is where the epiglottis is, and it continues to the bottom, which is where you find the start of the cartilage, which is more important for the trachea, the next stage. But for now, let's focus solely on the larynx itself. Between the start of the larynx and the bottom, you have a straight tube, which is constricted in several places. This constriction is then supported further by a mucous membrane, muscles, and several folds that project into the cavity. The upper part of these folds are known as the false vocal cords, and they have no role in vocalization. The lower vocal cords are responsible for vocalization. Overall, it is the tensioning of these and their size which has an effect on your voice. After the larynx, we enter the start of the lower respiratory tract. This begins at the trachea immediately below the larynx and the voice box. The trachea is very much defined by rings of hyaline cartilage that initially partially encircle the trachea. The further into the trachea you go, the more of the trachea is encircled by this cartilage, the purpose of which is to hold the trachea open. That means air can pass freely into the lungs, which is good. This progressively more circular shape is used as the esophagus passes and presses against the back of the trachea. If a food bolus passed by hyaline cartilage that is completely circular, it might get stuck. Leaving part of the back of the trachea open lets the esophagus press against the trachea and pass mostly freely. There is very little smooth muscle to speak of in this part of the lower respiratory tract called the trachea. This is also where the common passages to both lungs come to an end. From here, although the functions are mirrored, slight differences exist between the left and right bronchi and bronchioles. This is largely a result of the way the right lung has one more lobe than the left lung. This is to make room for the heart. Since the heart takes up a relatively large amount of space within the thorax, you need to accommodate this by not having one lobe in the left lung. Before discussing the lungs, though, we need to describe two more air vessels, and discussion of these is important, not just because they feed into these functional units of the lungs, but because of what they can do when things go wrong. Each bronchus branches into smaller secondary bronchi, and then secondary bronchi into smaller tertiary bronchi. The smallest of these then become bronchioles. The bronchioles end in alveolar ducts. The further down into the bronchi you get, the greater the space between the cartilaginous rings and the more smooth muscle is present, until only smooth muscle makes up the bronchioles. This is very important for two reasons. The first is fairly obvious. It limits how much air can enter the lungs. This is relevant if you are breathing in very moist, cold, or hot air. The extreme changes in temperature could cause harm. The same thing with excess moisture. By slowing it down, you have more time to equilibrate with the body's temperature or humidity. The other is perhaps less obvious, that is defense of the lungs. By stopping bacteria before they enter the alveoli, you can ensure that gas exchange happens. This means you always have supply of oxygen to the body and removal of CO2. This is done by the mucus escalator, or mucosary escalator as it's also called. A process whereby mucus catches foreign particles or pathogens, and then cilia move this up to the pharynx, where you can either expel the material, or it is passed down the epiglottis to the stomach, where it is destroyed by stomach acid. The movement of material is called the mucosary escalator or mucus escalator. The same system also has a rather significant downside. It is part of the immune system. This means it can learn to react. That reaction can be overblown, or what is called a hypersensitivity reaction. That reaction is more commonly demonstrated in asthma. The immune system releases a signal that a pathogen or some other stimulant is present. This stimulant causes an extreme response from mast cells that release way too much histamine. Histamine causes inflammation. That inflammation closes off the bronchi and bronchioles. While this active defense is good as it prevents pathogens or foreign particles from moving further into the lungs and specifically to the alveoli. It also prevents the flow of air, air being a rather essential part of most people's lives.
Frequently.
What happened to your leg?
Your doctor probably was concerned about the strength of the medicine, too. She probably weighed that danger against the danger of not breathing. Oxygen is so important during those prepubescent years, don't you think? Okay,
Alveoli ducts are where the alveoli or gas exchange unit of the lungs are fed and discharge gases or air. The tiniest bronchioles end in these alveolar ducts, which terminate in clusters of small air sacs called alveoli. These are the part of the lung that's most important. Each cluster of alveoli resemble a bunch of grapes. Each bunch is fed by the alveolar duct. The alveoli are the functional unit within the lungs. Their structure and function is very specialized and somewhat complex, not necessarily because of the actual structure of it, but because of how it works. You have the alveoli, and each of these is just a single membrane thick. Next to it, you have the capillary. The capillary is where blood flows through. The very thin wall between these is enough to separate the liquid blood from getting into the gas-based alveoli, but it also means gas can get from the alveoli into the blood and then into the red blood cells. The simplest explanation of this mechanism is that you have lots of air outside your body. This is rich in oxygen. Inside your body, the blood is carrying back both CO2 and unused oxygen, but CO2 is in much greater concentrations than outside the body. As blood enters the capillary bed at the start next to the alveoli, and air enters the alveoli, you get an exchange from high concentration of CO2 at the start of the capillary that enters into the alveoli. As the blood continues to flow through, the high concentration of O2 enters the blood from the alveoli into the capillary. This ensures that as blood leaves, it carries away oxygen having discharged its CO2. And this is very important. That gradient is essential. Without the high CO2 inside blood going into the low CO2 in the alveoli, and high O2 in the alveoli going into low O2 in the blood, you would not get exchange. Further to that functional description, the material around each alveoli is made up of an elastic-like connective tissue. This will try to pull the lungs back to their original size and shape when you release pressure from the muscles and skeleton that allow air to enter. By itself, this does not just happen though, and this brings us to the last part of the respiratory system, and it is the muscles and skeleton. But it has no direct involvement with the movement of air, but without this, you would not see any gas exchange, even at a remote kind of scale needed for an organism the size of a human. That is the muscles and skeleton, although primarily speaking about the muscles as they will pull on the skeleton. You have both the diaphragm and intercostal muscles. Intercostal muscles are those between and around your ribs. These primarily are working during normal respiration, as other muscles come into play when you are actively breathing. That is, for example, when you are exercising. As you breathe in, it requires the air be at a lower pressure than the outside world. That makes a negative gradient with the low end inside your body and the high end outside. This is achieved by dropping the diaphragm down through contraction of the diaphragm muscle. That will increase the volume of room in your thorax or chest. Your ribs will remain stationary for the purposes of this part, but the bottom is lower now. That increases the vertical size of your thorax. Though at the same time this is happening, your ribs are also pulled back towards the spine through the intercostal muscles. These cause the thorax to expand to the sides and forwards. That now increases the volume horizontally. By doing so, you increase the X, Y, and Z axis of your chest. In doing this, the air in your lungs is now at a lower pressure, as it expands to try and fill the space that you've made available, but the amount of gas is unchanged. That means it has to go to a lower pressure, as you're now spreading the same amount of gas over a bigger area. As a result, air will move from the outside world into your lungs until you can achieve something closer to equilibrium with the normal atmospheric pressure outside your body. To breathe out, you stop the muscle contractions, as muscles will simply go back to their normal size when you're no longer contracting them. They return to their original state. This means that you no longer have any muscle force increasing the size of the thoracic cavity, and so the thoracic cavity volume is reduced. Diaphragm rises, rib cage contracts, and this in combination with the elastic connective tissue of the alveoli practically squeezes air out like a sponge being squished. As you can see, the respiratory tract is very complex. It not only requires that the body works in conjunction and with coordination, but that the outside world is cooperative. In fact, this is a major reason why those climbing extremely high mountains need auxiliary oxygen. There is not enough of it present in the atmosphere at higher elevation for it to move from a high concentration to low concentration in the alveoli. The brilliance of the respiratory tract is that it requires a relative minimum of energy from the body. That is because it takes advantage of naturally occurring forces, such as pressure gradients, to achieve much of the work. But it's also prone to many of the same faults as the rest of the body, particularly when it comes to either things like damage to the body, in the case of a pneumothorax, or penetration from the outside world to the lungs, issues to do with the immune system, or simply becoming infected because of the direct nature of the lungs, or more specifically, the straight line from your mouth all the way down to where the bronchi start. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.